So this past weekend, something happened that not a lot of MMA fans seem to be very happy about. And yeah, I'm definitely one of them. I never thought in my life that I would ever be saying anything like this, but this past weekend, Jake Paul, of all people, managed to somehow secure, a victory in an 8-round boxing match over the former middleweight champion of the world, Anderson Silva. Yeah, I know, it just sounds wrong. And of all the people that you would expect to be quiet about it, it shouldn't really be all that surprising that Dana White has actually been pretty quiet about it. I mean, maybe people should expect him to be a little bit more talkative about it because, I mean, in all honesty, it does seem like this fight was, it was Dana White's, this was Dana White's idea in the beginning. When Jake Paul was beating Ben Askren, when he was beating Tyrone Woodley, Dana White was the one who came forward and said, well, hey, Anderson Silva, he's out of his UFC contract. I don't see you fighting him. Well, now it happened, and now at least on paper, Jake Paul has that win over one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. And while I think that a lot of people might be surprised that Dana White has been so quiet about it, I think that maybe people are misreading the situation a little bit. Because really, when you take a look at what happened, between Anderson Silva and Jake Paul, what it really comes down to is something so simple as this. You have this character who is more of a social media influencer than he is an actual fighter, who is handpicking his opponents, making sure that he is picking opponents that for the most part can't beat him, don't really have much of a chance to beat him. And he managed to eke out, in this particular case, what is definitely a pretty questionable win. I mean, I watched that fight. I didn't pay for it, but I did watch it. And in all honesty, I am not of the opinion that Jake Paul actually won that fight. I think that the judging was, let's say, a little bit suspect. That decision is is debatable, to say the least. Now, where else have we heard this recently? Oh, that's right. Yeah, we heard this recently in the UFC with Sugar Sean O'Malley and Petr Yan. Another decision that is, certainly debatable. Honestly, in my opinion, I think that that O'Malley versus Yan is actually a little less debatable than Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva. But I also do happen to be the opinion of the that the judges handed the decision to the wrong fighter in that fight. I think that Petr Yan won the first 2 rounds. And then Sean O'Malley kind of definitely ran away with that 3rd round. Absolutely no question about that. And if this fight had been contested, say, in one championship, where they don't use that 10-point must system in MMA, where basically they do fight 3 separate rounds, but they score it as a single fight, in that particular case, then it would definitely be far less controversial. Sean O'Malley, I think, probably definitely would have come out as the winner of that fight if it were contested under those rules. But it wasn't contested under those rules. It was contested under UFC rules with the 10-point must system. Based on what I saw in that fight, I thought that Petr Yan was the winner. And so with that in mind, what it really comes down to is this, is that Dana White, he doesn't really have a leg to stand on here. He doesn't have anything to say because what could he honestly say about what transpired between Jake Paul and Anderson Silva that pretty much everybody already can't say about Petr Yan and Sean O'Malley? And interestingly enough, there are so many, there's so many different kind of factors that are weighing into even the conversation surrounding these 2 fights. They're virtually carbon copies of each other. You basically have 2 different camps of fighters, both of very dedicated fans. I think in each case you have one camp of fans that very much do think that their fighter won the fight. And in that particular case, I'm talking about Anderson Silva and Petr Yan. But then, on the other hand, I think that you have something that is entirely different. And I think, on the other hand, I think that you actually have a large segment of fans, you have that camp of fans, that don't really care if their fighter actually won, so long as they can say that he won. And in the case of Sean O'Malley, sometimes it literally comes down to whether or not they can just find an excuse to say that he won. And I've noticed this for a while now as it relates to both of these fighters. And I've honestly been having a very difficult time finding a good explanation for as to why. At least until recently. So I was sitting with some friends of mine and we were watching that Sean O'Malley Petr Yan fight. And we were pretty much, all three of us were all we're all of the opinion, Petr Yan won. The decision was a little bit sketchy. And then when they put the mic in Sean O'Malley's hands to have him address the questions that he was getting from Daniel Cormier, he honestly kind of looked like he had no idea how to answer the question. But eventually they did manage to kind of center himself enough so that he could actually say the following phrase. And this just turned the light bulb on in my head that explained so much of it. And he got on the mic and he said, I definitely think that the fans want to see me as the bantamweight champion. And honestly, I think that for the most part, that's probably not necessarily true. I don't think that most UFC fans are deeply emotionally invested into whether or not Sean O'Malley is the bantamweight champion of the world. I think that most of them just want the best fighter in the bantamweight division, regardless of who it is. And who knows, maybe it could be Sean O'Malley. I don't think that it is, but it could be. But I think that most of the fans just want to see the best bantamweight fighter as the bantamweight champion of the world. But O'Malley's of an entirely different opinion. O'Malley thinks that the fans are deeply emotionally invested in making sure that that champion is him. But I think that as you ponder this idea, it kind of emerges, what emerges in my mind is another kind of separation between different types of fans. And that being the separation between the active participant and that of the spectator. Now, as it happens, at least as it pertains to the UFC in particular, 99.9% fans are mostly spectators. But there is one further difference within the fan base, and that is those who actively train in one martial art or another, and those who just watch. Because I think that for those who actively train in one martial art or another, or perhaps in multiple martial arts disciplines, the idea that they would want to see anybody else as the bantamweight champion of the world or the champion of any other weight class is not really a thought that exists within their mind. I think that a lot of those fans, if they happen to be in that particular weight class, would rather themselves be the bantamweight champion of the world than see Sean O'Malley as the bantamweight champion of the world. I think that most of them have a very keen understanding that it's probably not in the cards for them to be the bantamweight champion of the world, but in terms of what they want, that's what they would really want. And now, on the other hand, for those fans who are not active participants in any way, shape, or form, who knows, maybe they're not even really fight fans so much as they're Sean O'Malley fans. Well, then maybe they might just want to see Sean O'Malley as the bantamweight champion of the world. But then you have to keep in mind that they're not an active participant. They're just a consumer. And as it just so happens, consumerism does very much push most sports fans into the role of the spectator, even while some of them might even adopt the trappings of an active participant. I mean, like, for example, you might consider to be, say, like a sports fan that may have never played a football game in their life, may have never actually played in a game of football, but might own every jersey that was ever put out by their favorite team. And then wears that to the game as if they're ready to jump on the field or start playing, or maybe even wear them while they're watching the team at home. So yeah, actually, this is a very common thing in sports. This is not, this role of the fan as the consumer is nothing new. The consumer, the spectator as consumer, consumer as spectator. This is nothing new, and to really understand exactly how this became so important in pro sports, you have to remember, in particular, how combat sports became a business in the first place. I mean, it very much is, a byproduct of modern prosperity. Because several generations ago, this was something that we just, as a human species, we just didn't have the luxury to have. It's very much a product of capitalist prosperity, and it's very much a product of just the sheer luxury of an era of mostly peaceful relations within the world. Because let's face it, if you're living in a place in the world where you are constantly beset by your enemies, you don't really have the luxury of sending your best fighters to go fight in a ring or in a cage for money. You probably need them out on the barricades. If you have any doubt about whether or not that can be the case and whether or not that can influence something like this in that way, look at what went on with Ukraine after the Russians invaded. When the Bellator welterweight champion basically put his championship aside and said, I'm going to go and I'm not going to defend this right now. I'm going to go defend my country instead. Boxing phenom Vasily Lomachenko did the exact same thing. They didn't have the luxury of being able to do that, of being able to go and fight in a ring or in a cage anymore. So instead, they went and fought in the trenches for real. Now, personally, I can't imagine Jake Paul or Sugar Sean O'Malley in a foxhole. I would actually have a very hard time imagining any of their friends on the front line of a... Now, personally, I can't imagine Sugar Sean O'Malley or Jake Paul, in a foxhole. And I have a very much... Now, personally, I have a hard time imagining Sugar Sean O'Malley or Jake Paul in a foxhole. And I have every bit as difficult a time imagining any of their fans being on the front line of a war. And fortunately, at this particular time, things are as such that we don't really need to, at least not imminently. But speaking at least for myself, that was a realization about the way that the state of this sport reflects the state of the world, and vice versa, that in all honesty, I didn't expect to take away from a Jake Paul fight. Not in a million.